vision. Think of Dickens. And yet, in the novel, as in science, something has happened. There has been a loss of certainty, of coherence. What fiction writer in these postmodernist times would have the nerve to declare that he has created a world which will symbolize the real one in which we live? As Thomas Mann writes in his great novel, Dr. Faustus, the question is whether at the present stage of our consciousness, our knowledge, our sense of truth, this little game is still permissible, still intellectually possible, still to be taken seriously. Whether the work of art as such, the construction, self-sufficing, or harmonically complete in itself, still stands in any legitimate relation to the complete insecurity, problematic conditions, and lack of harmony of our social situation. Whether all seeming, even the most beautiful, even precisely the beautiful, has not today become a lie. Breath has gone from the work of art, as Beckett was among the first to recognize. In his essay on Proust, he insists, that the only real progression possible for us is a progression in depth. Down we must go, with Kafka down into the burrow, out of the big world and into the dark underground of ourselves. The novelist no longer pretends to be any less baffled or blind than anyone else. Finding itself in the same lifeboat as science has not made the novel any more accommodating to its cold companion. The relationship between literature and science has always been an uneasy one, certainly in the modern age. Even Goethe, the great polymath, himself a scientist of no little originality, regarded the pursuit of scientific knowledge with deep suspicion. A number of his characters are scientists, especially in the Wilhelm Meister novels, and indeed the title of his novel, Die Wahlverwandtschaften, translated into English as elective affinities, is a technical term taken from chemistry. Yet the essential Goethean exemplar of the willfulness of science is, of course, Faust. The myth of the arrogant doctor who sold his soul for mere knowledge is as potent today as it was at the end of the 18th century, when Goethe joined battle with the ghost of Dr. Isaac Newton. In Newton's mechanistic picture of the world, Goethe saw a profound threat to the spiritual health of man. The poet was for balance in all things. In this, he was at one with the men of the Renaissance, such as Ficino and Paracelsus, for whom man, not nature, was the magnum miraculum. Goethe distrusted the paraphernalia of science, microscopes, telescopes, all such engines, as he called them, which violate the frontiers of human and humane perception. What could not be seen with the naked eye, what could not be touched, was, for Goethe, no concern of ours, was unnatürlich, his most damning epithet. An opposing view is offered by a more recent writer, the Belgian novelist Marguerite Yourcenar. In her novel L'œuvre au noir, The Abyss, Yourcenar portrays Renaissance man in his finest flowering. She takes her epigraph from the Neoplatonist Pico della Mirandola's great oration on and to man. Other species are confined to a prescribed nature. No limits have been imposed upon you, however. You determine your nature by your own free will. Yourcenar's protagonist, Zeno, is a kind of anti-Faust. He is a natural philosopher who, in his alchemical investigations, aims not merely to transmute base metal for gain, but to discover the secret laws of nature. The gold Zeno lusts for is the gold of pure knowledge. His science, therefore, is a philosophical, even a kind of aesthetic pursuit. Zeno differs from Faust in subtle ways. He is much more modern. We in our time recognize only too well the note of sadness and resignation which sounds deep down in the abyss. Zeno is a Stoic. The times in which he lives permit the wise man no other response than the stoical. The novel's account here of the horrors of the siege of Münster and its aftermath shows us the reverse side of the golden age of the Renaissance. Yourcenar is no romancer, but a learned and hard-headed realist. Goethe's Faust may work all kinds of wicked deeds and yet be saved by the prayers of a simple maid. Yourcenar's Zeno knows that such redemption is not possible, not for humankind. He foresees the splitting of the atom and is later condemned to be burned at the stake. He goes out sadly, bravely, with few illusions, and with scant hope in posterity. Although The Abyss is a wonderful novel, it has its flaws. Chief of these is that Zeno is quite simply too good to be true. He is a kind of Frankenstein's monster in reverse, assembled out of bits of real figures such as Giordano Bruno, Pico, Ficino, Leonardo Galileo. He is too well-fashioned, too rounded, too much without blemish to be convincingly human. All those great men had their meaner sides. Perhaps we would value Zeno more if he were less wise. A novel that, though not as successful artistically as The Abyss, seems to me to portray with more accuracy the scientific life. And this is Max Brod's Tycho Brahe's Weg zu Gott, translated as The Redemption of Tycho Brahe. First published in the 1920s, and this book is now largely forgotten, Brod's novel is a fictionalized account of the brief but momentous collaboration, if that is the word, between the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe and the great cosmologist Johannes Kepler. Though Brahe was not a master synthesizer like Copernicus or Kepler or Galileo, he was nevertheless a man of vision, whose recognition of the necessity for systematic and meticulous chartings of planetary movement was a vital contribution to the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. When they met, Kepler was 28, Brahe was in his 50s. Kepler had been a schoolmaster at a provincial school. Brahe was in the employ of the Emperor Rudolf II. Within 2 years, Brahe was dead, and Kepler had been appointed to succeed him as imperial mathematician. In the confrontation between the gifted but limited Brahe and the driven, ailing, and inspired Kepler, Brod surely saw, as George Steiner has suggested, an eerie prefiguring of his own relation to another K, whose work Brod would champion, work which in time would be seen to tower above his own comparatively modest writings. Of such sort was Kepler, Brod writes in the novel. He had no heart and therefore had nothing to fear from the world. He was not capable of emotion or of love, and for that reason he was naturally also secure against the aberrations of feeling. This is not a description of Franz Kafka, nor of Brod's opinion of him, yet we cannot help but detect in it the anguished cry of a man of mere talent confronted with the spectacle of genius. Towards the end of the novel, Brod has Brahe realize that Kepler does not exist outside of us. No, indeed, each of us has his Kepler within him, and it is in facing him, in facing his own Kepler, that he has to endure the sharpest spiritual tests. In putting at the center of his novel a scientist who is not of the first rank, Brod takes a risk which in the end proves fruitful, and that it provides him with a platform, as it were, from which to view the baffling phenomenon of genius at work. All the same, the novel fails in the end to convince. Kepler is regarded with too much awe to allow any real understanding of him as man and scientist to emerge. We feel for and with Brahe as he faces death with the knowledge that his life's work may go for nothing. "Let me not seem to have lived in vain," was his last pitiful cry. But Kepler remains at a distance, shadowy and enigmatic, a kind of hunger artist, his face turned away towards the music of the spheres. Perhaps it is asking too much of any novel to unravel the intricacies of the scientific mind. C.P. Snow, for all his desire to bridge the gap between the famous two cultures, portrays for us not scientists but technologists. But then Snow's wooden style simply would not have been up to the task of capturing physicists of the caliber of Rutherford or Dirac. Those who have the style are busy elsewhere. Vladimir Nabokov surely could have managed it. Imagine a Nabokov novel based on the life of a Gödel or an Oppenheim. It is tantalizing to see Nabokov toying in his novel Ada, especially, and in some of the short stories, with the opalescent possibilities along the byways and blind alleys of modern scientific theory. John Updike, too, has put a toe into the heavy water here and there. Witness his perfect little poem on the subject of the neutrino. And perhaps he will yet take the full plunge. But these are scant straws to clutch at. In general, novelists have steadfastly avoided the challenge of writing about science and scientists. If the Victorians, whom nothing could cow, did not see fit to grapple with science, how should we later faint hearts dare? And yet it is a puzzle. Fear of ideas cannot explain it. The novel has never flinched in the face of philosophical ideas, from George Eliot to Mary McCarthy, from Diderot to Sartre. But then philosophy is part of the humanities, and there's the rub. Fiction takes as its subject man, the man who exists in heart or head, not in the coils of genetic structure or the seething subatomic foam. Science, in the suspicious artist's view of it at least, as its first act puts aside the merely human. Even biology is not about man, but about blood and bones and ganglia. And then science is forever interfering with things. As Martin Heidegger put it in his great essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, sounding perhaps not incidentally an uncanny echo of Goethe, colour shines and wants only to shine, writes Heidegger. When we analyse it in rational terms by measuring its wavelengths, it is gone. It shows itself only when it remains undisclosed and unexplained. Earth thus shatters every attempt to penetrate into it. It causes every merely calculating importunity upon it to turn into a destruction. Heidegger here is stating, with an added moral extension, as it were, Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy, which, put simply, says that we cannot investigate darkness by bathing it in light. A seemingly innocent observation, but one which, in the world of atomic physics, has enormous consequences. Surely not only the scientific, but the artistic mind as well will find such ideas exciting. For the scientist, the significance of indeterminacy will consist in the nature of the limitations it imposes. For the artist, the interest will be aesthetic. Beckett has remarked in Waiting for Godot that he used the principle of Christ and the two crucified thieves, one saved, one damned, not for its religious or philosophical implications, but because he liked the shape of the idea. This is surely an extremely important distinction. In art, the only absolute criterion is shape, form, ratio, harmony, call it what you will. Call it order. To quote Wallace Stevens again, I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around, no longer wild. This is what art does or seeks to do. It imposes a synthetic order upon the chaos. The word synthetic in this context perhaps requires definition. I intend it to mean not false, artificial, but, as the dictionary says, of, pertaining to, consisting in, combination of parts in a whole, constructive. A principle even so severe and seemingly negative as Heisenberg's law of indeterminacy seems to offer, in its simplicity, in its calmness, above all in its beauty, a means of imposing order upon the wilderness. At the very least, it is bracing in its intellectual rigor. Mysteriously, it makes us smile. And its effects are not exclusively noetic. What could be closer to commonplace experience than a principle which tells us that we cannot have our cake and eat it? Novels I have mentioned are about scientists, not science, not the ideas themselves. Fiction cannot dispense with people, or if it does, it relinquishes its rights and powers and becomes something else. But do we have to leave the matter there? Do we have to accept without question Friedrich Schiller's dictum in On the Naive and Sentimental Literature, that literature only possesses these two fields: either it must dwell in the world of the senses, or it must dwell in the world of ideas? In my own attempts to meet this question, I've tried in my novels on Copernicus and Kepler especially, not only to portray the men and their times, but, more importantly, to illustrate something of their ideas by means of an orchestration of formal narrational movement and rhythm. That is, not the ideas, but the idea of the ideas. As Adorno remarks in Aesthetic Theory, the unresolved antagonisms of reality reappear in art in the guise of imminent problems of artistic form. This, and not the deliberate injection of objective moments or social content, defines art's relation to society. or one might add, indeed,